Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. It's so wonderful to see so many beautiful faces today. So I am the current president for the ACEL-Tucson chapter. My name is Claudia Pham. ACEL, I just want to share a little bit about what ACEL is. So ACEL stands for Asian Corporate Entrepreneurs and Leaders. We're a nonprofit organization whose role is to empower AAPI professionals through elevating their voices in leadership. We want to see more Asian Americans in places of influence like public office, leadership roles. Despite the fact that Asian Americans are the fastest growing ethnic group in the US, growing for more than 80% from 2000 to 2019, only about 3% are in leadership roles, so vastly underrepresented. So ACEL's vision really is just about a world in which everyone has the skills and opportunities to lead, and we believe that there are four main pillars for this to happen. The first one is professional development and skills. The second is cultural awareness. The third is community service, and the fourth is mentorship. And the part that I'm part of ACEL is that ACEL is not only about providing resources for the individual for their own professional development, but it's a lot about uplifting one another. And so that's what we hope to achieve, is to kind of uplift each other and sharing of resources. So with that, we are here today to celebrate the rich history, traditions, and culture of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders to the US. It's important to not only recognize the obstacles that we have overcome in the past, but also to recognize the current hurdles we have today in order to utilize the resources we have in order to uplift one another. So thank you everyone for coming to this event today. I especially want to thank the APIDA Fund of the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona, as well as our speaker who's about to speak, Richard Koo, for collaborating with us for this event. Hope we can continue to have these conversations and to learn and grow from one another. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Happy APIDA Heritage Month this month. Yay! Yes, thank you all for joining us this evening. We're really excited to have you here. I'm Jeannie Lee. I'm on the advisory board of the APIDA Fund, which is part of the community, you can see it right here, Community Foundation of Southern Arizona, where we are located today for this event. So I want to tell you a little bit about the APIDA Fund so that you guys can get to know us and join us in our work. So the Asian Pacific Islander Desi American Fund of CFSA strives to build partnerships for activities related to anti-Asian hate, hence our session this evening, as well as community health and well-being, community building, and advocacy. Our mission is to uplift APIDA voices, foster collaborations, and champion equity through philanthropy and direct action. So this is part of our direct action in working with ACEL today for this event. The APIDA Fund will formally launch this fall. So we had our soft launch and we're having some events, but we will formally launch this fall in October. So I hope that you are all excited to join us then. We'll have a large launch event in this location in October, so please stay tuned for that information. But today we're really excited to be able to partner with ACEL to bring this vital session to you. And we want to thank the CFSA for providing this location and this setting, as well as to ACEL for providing refreshments. Hopefully you've grabbed some. We have some yummy refreshments that ACEL provided for this evening. And we want to, of course, thank our speaker, Richard Koo. So please enjoy this session and stay tuned for more information about our fall lunch. And with that, I will invite Richard up here to introduce himself and start the session for us.
Thank you, Jeannie, and thank you, Claudia. I'm Richard Koo. I'm a recovering attorney. I'm retired now. And We moved to Tucson about 11 years ago from New York. I think I started this presentation, preparing for it more than 40 years ago, after Vincent Chin was murdered in Detroit. And the sad thing is that the content, there's more and more content to add to this, particularly in the last 3 months. And we'll get to all of that later. But first off, I'd like to thank ACEL and the APIDA Fund for making this presentation possible. By the way, I am a proud member of ACEL. I am a proud member of the advisory board of the APIDA Fund, and I'm also the vice chair of the board of the Community Foundation. I hope you'll walk away tonight with food for thought, and I'm not talking about the shrimp back there. But before we go any further, I'd like to preface the presentation because I want you to understand where I'm coming from. For most of us, the United States has been and continues to be the land of opportunity. And depending on when they immigrated, for our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents as well. There are many shining moments and grand achievements in U.S. history that we can point to. Well, we're not doing that today. Instead, today we'll be focusing on some dark historical moments, oftentimes overlooked in U.S. history. And we will talk about how some of what we see in today's news in real time can be traced to some of those dark moments. But dwelling on darkness is not necessarily a bad thing, because when you shine light on the darkness, you can more clearly see where the path leads. So the presentation tonight is not to denigrate our great nation or anyone within it, historical or otherwise. To the contrary, it's to show how deeply we care about this nation, its history, and its future. So here's the plan. Let's talk first about some acronyms. Whoa, here's the excitement. And then we'll proceed with a brief survey of Asian American history covering almost 200 years. Then we'll highlight some major takeaways from the history we surveyed, and from there we'll touch on some current events that echo themes in history, and then end up with a short list of things we can consider doing to push back against some threatening governmental actions. We'll do a Q&A at the end if we have time. Sound good? Great. Okay, terms and acronyms. Let's first grapple with some confusing terms and acronyms that will be used throughout this presentation. The quote on the upper right-hand side of the slide is from Viet Thanh Nguyen. He's a Pulitzer Prize writer. And to illustrate his point, it's rare for someone born in Asia to self-identify as an Asian. One is first and foremost Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Korean, Filipino, Pakistani, and so on. A couple of young activists in the 1960s figured out that in America, political capital can be enhanced by claiming a larger constituency and greater numbers, and can be generated by terminology that's more inclusive. They started with the term Asian American. That includes people whose countries of origin were in the Far East and Southeast Asia. Over the years, Asian American then expanded into AAPI and AANHPI. And I think the inclusion of Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians is self-explanatory. Now the acronym has morphed once again in some quarters to include DESI. DESI countries of origin include Afghanistan, Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Together, APIDA stands for Asian Pacific Islander Desi American. It's a mouthful, but it's an intentionally broad and inclusive pan-ethnic classification. APIDAs represent roughly 7%, or 24 million, of the total US population. And the population of the APIDA countries of origin account for more than half the world's population. For purposes of this presentation, I will generally use Asian Americans or APIDA, even though AANHPI or API could otherwise be used. Now that we've digested the salad of acronyms, let's take a quick spin through history. Now, let me just make a disclaimer here. Some colleges hold year-long courses on APIDA history. So I'm making it clear that what we're covering here is just selected hits, selected highlights, and we're not going to be able to get into it with a great deal of depth. Now, if you've kept your eyes open, you might have noticed that you can find Asians virtually everywhere on Earth. So chances were very good that there were a few Asians in the United States at the start of the 19th century, although we have no historical record about them. One of the first historical record of an Asian in the US was Ah Fong Moy. You can read a very brief synopsis of her life, and probably it was a sad one, on the right-hand side of the slide. It was reported that Martin Van Buren, when he was the country's vice president, even visited Ah Fong in one of her exhibitions. But let's face it, it wasn't Ah Fong Moy who signed the contract that limited her term to 2 years. Somebody did it for her. Maybe no contract was signed at all. So she was really an indentured servant, a slave, and used as a commodity to earn her handlers some money. Her bound feet, in markedly different countenance and garb, were objects of fascination in a grotesque way. And exhibiting her alongside of chinoiserie objects dehumanized her. And since there were a few Chinese in America with public standing at the time, it dehumanized her entire race. Now, who here has ever seen shoes that fits a woman with bound feet? Anybody? Okay. Who here wants to see shoes that fit women? Come on, raise your hand. All right. We have a pair there. Okay. So Corinne's feet are small, but that's not hers. So, you know, it was a bit of morbid fascination for the American public to see Ah Fong Moy, and they were willing to pay money to P.T. Barnum to see her in a sideshow. The first wave of significant Asian mass migration involved the Chinese. First in the 1850s, after gold was discovered in California, and then as a source of cheap labor to help build the transcontinental railroads starting in the 1860s. Can anyone think of what happened in US history in the 1860s that gave rise to a need for the importation of cheap labor from abroad? Anyone? No? Civil War. So the Civil War, a lot of young white Americans were killed and put a stop in many parts of the country to the use of slave labor. The first intercontinental railroad was completed in 1869, 7 years ahead of schedule. Do you see anything unusual or that's missing from the commemoration photos?
No Chinese.
No Chinese. Right. Although they represented 90% of the railroad construction workforce, none of the Chinese railroad workers were included in the 1869 photo, nor were any of their descendants invited to be part of the 2019 photo. I have no comment. Following the completion of the transcontinental railroads, the Chinese workers dispersed and settled down in communities with other Chinese. It didn't take long before the general populace started to riot, lynch some of the Chinese, and burn down their shoddy habitats with a view to running them out of town. Then in 1875, the Page Act technically barred the admission of coolie labor and immoral Chinese women to the U.S. In practice, coolie laborers continued to be admitted to the U.S., notwithstanding the act, because frankly, cheap labor was still in demand, and nobody understood what coolie meant. However, the act did effectively bar the entry of virtually all Chinese women into the United States. With apologies to present company here, let me quote President Ulysses S. Grant when he encouraged Congress to pass the Page Act. Let me do this Grant impression here. I invite the attention of Congress to another, though perhaps no less an evil, the importation of Chinese women, but few of whom are brought to our shores to pursue honorable or useful occupations, end quote. In other words, according to President Grant, all but a few Chinese women were immoral. I don't know what you think about that. The Page Act, the 1982 Chinese Exclusion Act, and state anti-miscegenation laws together made it very difficult for Chinese men in the U.S. to be reunited with their families in China, or even to start a family in the U.S. On its face, the Exclusion Act was supposed to last for 10 years, but Congress continually extended it. It wasn't until 1943 that it was ended with the passage of the Magnuson Act. Some of the racist stereotypes in play today had their origin in images and concepts that go back 150 years or more ago. So, for example, throughout U.S. history, disease scapegoating has been a common way to stigmatize and marginalize groups of people who were foreign or different. Do you ever wonder why pandemic diseases are nicknamed to highlight their origins in a foreign land or their link to a marginalized group? Think of Spanish flu, gay virus, Middle East respiratory syndrome, the West Nile virus, the China virus. We don't ever hear of an American virus, do we? Or a New Jersey virus. However, that's, some of it is even true. It's been scientifically established that the Spanish flu originated in North America. And the purpose of the nicknames is to emphasize the foreignness of those diseases. The cartoon on the right, I like to call it the Chinese octopus man. It depicts a Chinese man whose hyper-productivity threatened the gainful employment of quote-unquote mainstream Americans. He arguably can serve as a precursor to the model minority myth on some level, and also brings to mind the Vincent Chin murder, which we will explore later. Now, these anti-immigrant tropes weren't limited to the Chinese or to the 19th century. They applied to each immigrant wave, including at different times in U.S. history, Irish, Italian, Jewish, and African Americans, just to name a few. This seems to be a chapter out of some anti-immigrant playbook that hasn't gone away and that we haven't frankly seen. Only a year ago, you might recall reading about the attacks on Haitians in Springfield, Ohio. Who were legally admitted to the United States, but who were falsely accused of eating all the geese in the surrounding community. So the eating of geese, mice, it seems to be a major theme in these anti-immigrant tropes, and not only for the Chinese. You can read about Wong Kim Ark, I hope, on the right-hand side of the slide, and his case in the Supreme Court that established birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment. However, I'd like to quote not from the opinion, but from the dissent that was written by Chief Justice Melville Fuller, who said, and again, let me put on my Supreme Court Justice voice, "I am of the opinion that the President and Senate by treaty and the Congress by naturalization have the power, notwithstanding the 14th Amendment, to prescribe that all persons of a particular race or their children cannot become citizens," end quote. This dissent actually reflects the view of the current administration, which is seeking to narrow birthright citizenship in a big way, as again we'll talk about later. By the way, it is remarkable that a young Chinese man, together with some family associations, were able to take this case to the Supreme Court and win in the 19th century. APIDA, like I defined before, covers many different ethnic groups who came to America. Each had a separate thread of history. Though the flow of Chinese immigrants was largely stemmed by legislation in the 1880s, the need for cheap labor from the Far East didn't stop. So the US government and economic forces promoted the immigration of low-cost laborers from the countries listed in sequential order on the right-hand side of the slide. I think this is best captured from a quote from a book called Atlas of Anti-Asian History, written by Monique Avakian, and it goes like this. The ebbing and flowing of American industry's demand for cheap and non-union labor played a key role in drawing migrant workers first from China and then from Japan, Korea, and India to America's shores. When laws were passed to stem the flow of immigrants from Asian countries, Filipinos were brought in for their cheap labor under the guise that their admission did not constitute immigration because the Philippines became a US territory following the Spanish-American War of 1898. It is no accident that this first wave of immigration from the Far East coincided with the end of the US slavery system and soon thereafter with the birth and growth of the American labor movement. Active recruitment of each successive group of laborers from Asia was a direct result of racially based animosity toward prior groups. So it's like a washing machine. You know, one group comes in, people get tired of them, and you invite another group. Following World War I, US isolation took hold. Isolationism took hold. The Cable Act of 1922 allowed the government to punish American females who married immigrants, ending their US citizenship if they did, and prohibited female immigrants from marrying male US citizens. Can anyone in this room speculate why this law only penalized American women and not men? Any thoughts?
They can't produce.
What?
They cannot produce.
No, I think it was the men who passed the laws, no? This is in addition to state anti-miscegenation laws that were prevalent at the time. anti-miscegenation laws prohibit interracial marriage. The last one was declared unconstitutional only in 1967 in Virginia. The Immigration Act of 1924 essentially shut down all legal immigration from all countries in Asia. Immigration aside, there were plenty of other state and local laws that discriminated against APIDAs. For example, there were alien land laws restricting the ownership of land by an APIDA. There were discriminatory practices in public establishments. For example, no dogs are Chinese here. And many acts of violence against APIDAs occurred during this period. As we will explore later in this presentation, when we read today's news, sometimes it feels like we're going back in time. Many of the Micronesian islands were colonized by Western nations in the 19th century, and the US, as a colonial power, was no exception. For example, the US acquired Guam from Spain and the Northern Mariana Islands from Germany as a result of the Spanish-American War of 1898. Hawaii was ruled as a hereditary monarchy in the 19th century, and the islands were first attracted the interest of American missionaries, Christian missionaries, then followed by Western economic interests. Following the Civil War, Hawaii became the sugar plantations in Hawaii became very profitable. But the 1890 McKinley tariffs triggered an economic depression. Did you hear that? Tariffs did what? The sugar growers, mainly white Americans, pressed for the US annexation of Hawaii to avoid the impact of the tariffs. Impatient with the progress, they led a coup d'etat against Queen Liliuokalani. I didn't say that right. But in 1893, and called for the intervention of the US military under the pretext of protecting US national interests. That's a staged photo of the US military protecting the US interests, national interests. Doesn't seem like there were too much violence going on. Now, to his credit, President Grover Cleveland believed that the Americans had acted shamefully in the coup and ordered an investigation. The investigation resulted in a joint resolution of apology of Congress that stated the US diplomatic and military representatives had abused their authority and were responsible for the change in government. So President Cleveland called for the restoration of the monarchy. However, that didn't happen quite fast enough, because when he left office, President McKinley signed an executive order annexing the Hawaiian Islands. You get the theme about executive orders, don't you? I would just mention, citizens of Canada, beware. Several additional Pacific islands were taken by the US coming out of World War II, and that's how the Marshall Islands became a US territory. The US, after acquiring the Marshall Islands, then proceeded to use part of the Marshall Islands as an atomic bomb testing site. That completely destroyed Marshallese over many generations in many ways: physical, economic, psychological, and societal, on top of rendering many of the islands totally uninhabitable. We move on to World War II. Executive Order 9066 was issued under the authority of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. The executive order didn't actually mention Japanese or Japanese Americans, but it did result in the incarceration of mostly people of Japanese origin. It's estimated that out of approximately 120,000 people who were incarcerated under the executive order, nearly 70,000 were Nisei, or second generation Japanese born in the United States, clearly US citizens. Many Japanese Americans, and this is not surprising, who were incarcerated lost their businesses, livelihood, properties, and assets, and those who did not cooperate with internment were sent to prison. As mentioned earlier, the Chinese Exclusion Act was finally repealed in 1943 with the passage of the Magnuson Act. The Magnuson Act permitted a quota of 105 Chinese immigrants nationally, not particularly generous. The fact that China was an ally of the US in World War II probably had something to do with its passage. Then, in 1949, the communist takeover resulted in the displacement of many Chinese people and a further loosening of the US immigration laws to take in refugees seeking to escape the communist rule, including many who had worked with the US government and military or supported its interest. Moving further on, the next decade, US involvement in the Korean War and the wars in Southeast Asia similarly led to the acceptance of many displaced refugees. Again, many who had worked for or fought alongside of the US military. In addition to that, there were tens of thousands of war brides and babies born out of relationships between Southeast Asian women and American servicemen. Many were left behind after the US withdrew, but some were brought into the US. In the mid-1960s, the civil rights movement played a significant role in prompting the government to reverse the flow of race-based immigration history, going back to the 1875 Page Act, replacing it with a system that prioritized refugees, skilled immigrants, and those with families in the United States. What also happened is rising income and educational levels of some APIDAs gave birth to the model minority myth. What is the model minority myth? Well, it goes like this, and this is not what I believe. APIDAs are polite, law-abiding people who have achieved a higher level of success than the general population through some combination of innate talent and pull yourselves up by your bootstraps immigrant striving. The myth perpetuates a narrative in which APIDAs are math and science whizzes or musical geniuses. Tiger moms force their children to work harder and be better than anybody else. Meanwhile, and this is hard for me to say, even though it's not true, nerdy, effeminate dads hold prestigious but not leadership positions in STEM industries and medicine and accounting. So what's so bad about this, you ask? Oh, plenty. The myth discards individual differences and reinforces the stereotypes that APIDAs are all the same, and that they are and always will be different as a group. In other words, they're always perpetual foreigners. The myth erases historical racism and clouds the continuing racism against APIDAs in the US. And last but not least, the myth is used as a cudgel against other ethnic or racial groups, supporting claims that APIDAs are doing well and that if other groups would only work harder, have stronger family bonds, and get over the history of oppression, they too would succeed. While there is some statistical aspects of the myth, for example, higher income levels than national average, the myth is generally misleading and false. It obscures differences, like the fact that out of the 10% of Asian Americans who live below the federal poverty line, under the 2022 census data. The rate was 19% for Burmese Americans, 17% for Hmong Americans, and 17.6% for Pacific Islanders. Rising income and educational levels of some Asian Americans, along with the Japanese economic miracle and dominance in electronics and automobiles industries in the 80s, led to feelings of economic competitiveness, which in turn fueled a rise in anti-APIDA hate crimes. There were many horrendous and shocking anti-Asian American hate crimes during this period. Far too many for me to get into here, but one that really mobilized many APIDA of my generation. It was the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982. 27-year-old Chin was an engineering student. He was celebrating his upcoming wedding at a Detroit bar with friends when an unemployed auto worker laid off because of Detroit's competition with Japanese automakers, and his stepson spewed anti-Japanese epithets at Chin. Chin, as you might have guessed, wasn't of Japanese ancestry. He was of Chinese ethnicity. A fight ensued, and Chin was chased to a nearby restaurant where he was beaten to death with a baseball bat by the two men. The two men were charged with second-degree murder and pled to manslaughter. The presiding judge sentenced them to a fine of $3,780 each and 3 years probation. No jail time for the murder. Then 9/11 brought about increased hate crime, discrimination and bias against brown APIDAs, particularly Muslim APIDAs, and APIDAs that could be mistaken for Middle Eastern people. 81 hate incidents against Desis were reported in the week following 9/11. And it didn't stop there. As recently as 2012, a mass shooting in Oak Creek, Wisconsin occurred, where a 40-year-old man fatally shot 6 Sikh Americans and wounded 4 others. As you know, Sikh men wear turbans as part of their religion, and they're not from the Middle East, and they're not Muslim. It's another example where, when it comes to race, many Americans fail to make distinctions. It's not, but that's not to say that if they did make a distinction, it would make things better, right? All right, turn your head if you don't like to see violence. Well, the woman was knocked unconscious, but she survived. The COVID pandemic started in early 2020. By the way, I'm not loving the response of the onlookers. I don't know about you. In an incident in Oakland the same year, that is 2021, this is when this violence occurred, an 84-year-old Asian American, I think he was Thai American, was similarly shoved, but he died from his injuries. Another noteworthy 2021 incident was the murder of 8 Asian Americans in 3 different nail salons in Atlanta. And this is just a few of the 11,000 or so anti-Asian incidents during the pandemic years. The wave of anti-Asian violence was precipitated primarily by the reported likelihood that the pandemic patient 0 was from Wuhan, China. Inflamed by political rhetoric, sensationalism, and showmanship, including the Kung Flu statement, many in the US blamed the Chinese for the pandemic, and because many people don't make distinctions where race is concerned, Asian Americans were targeted for vitriol and violence. A lot of Asian Americans have never visited Wuhan, China, or even China itself. The spike in anti-Asian violence got so bad that President Biden signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act into law on May 20, 2021. Principally, the law required the U.S. Attorney General to designate a Department of Justice employee to expedite the review of hate crimes, provide money to encourage the creation of state-run hate crimes hotlines, provide grant money to law enforcement agencies that will train their officers to identify hate crimes, and introduce a series of public education campaigns around bias against people of Asian descent. Now, if this leaves you with a feeling of being underwhelmed, join the club. It was too little, it was too late. Nobody really talks about this law, even though anti-Asian sentiment has continued beyond the pandemic years. So, for example, in 2023, a FBI report revealed that there were roughly 465 hate crime offenses motivated by race, ethnicity, or ancestry involving Asian Americans. For the period from January 1, 2023 to August 31, 2024, a University of Chicago affiliate study noted that online anti-APIDA posts doubled during that period. The surge was directed in part against South Asians, Desis. Some speculate that the increase had something to do with Kamala Harris and Usha Vance being spotlighted during the election process. So these are some of the major takeaways on our brief and quick trip through history. Number one, and I will read these because this is like a synthesis of the past 200 years history that we talked about. For the most part, Asians were allowed to enter the U.S. when it served certain economic interests and were excluded, removed, or even harmed after those economic interests were served. In times of military, economic, political, and/or pandemic stress, people thought to be foreigners or immigrants were tagged as threats to the well-being of quote-unquote Americans. Baked into the psyche of many Americans is the prejudice that APIDAs are perpetual foreigners, perpetual immigrants. And lastly, and I'll play a video here to establish the point.
Of what nation are you a citizen?
Singapore.
Are you a citizen of any other nation?
No, Senator.
Have you ever applied for Chinese citizenship?
Senator, I served my nation in Singapore. No, I did not.
Do you have a Singaporean passport?
Yes, and I served my military for two and a half years in
Do you
Singapore.
have any other passports from any other nations?
No, Senator.
Your wife is an American citizen, your children are American citizens.
That's correct.
Have you ever applied for American citizenship?
Not yet.
Okay. Have you ever been a member of the Chinese Communist Party?
Senator, I'm Singaporean. No.
Have you ever been associated or affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party?
No, Senator. Again, I'm Singaporean.
Let me ask you some hopefully simple questions. You said earlier, in response to a question, that what happened at Tiananmen Square in June of 1989 was a massive protest. Did anything else happen in Tiananmen Square?
Yes, I think it's well documented. There was a massacre.
There was an indiscriminate slaughter of hundreds or thousands of Chinese citizens.
The video supports the proposition that many Americans, including those at the highest levels of federal government, don't make distinctions between Asian countries, people from those countries, and Americans with Asian heritage, or among APIDA constituents. Now, the interviewer in that video was Tom Cotton. He is a senator from Arkansas and the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. although this video arguably demonstrates a lack thereof. Let me re-emphasize that these historical takeaways don't apply only to APIDAs, but they're used in one way or another whenever to other immigrant groups throughout American history. At this point, let's take a quick trip through and a quick look at recent governmental actions that echo historical anti-Asian policies and have the potential to inflict a negative impact on APIDAs. However, in the interest of time, we're not going to delve into any of these items with any great depth. Otherwise, we'll be here for another week. First, a Committee of 100 report published on March 17, 2025, states that 22 states have adopted 38 bills that restrict foreign property ownership, out of which 17 have thus far been passed into law. Chinese ownership of land has been the main target of those bills. This is even though Blue Marble, which is an affiliate of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, reported for the year 2023 that Chinese ownership of land represented less than 1% of foreign land owned throughout the United States. Since the enforcement of many of these land ownership restriction laws are the subject of appeals filed by various parties, there's a long way to go before we find out the extent to which they survive the judicial process. Meanwhile, more and more of these bills along these lines are being introduced, including in Arizona. They haven't passed in Arizona yet, thank God. And on the federal side, 7 bills have been introduced in Congress restricting foreign land ownership and remain under consideration. Second, alien business restriction laws. State lawmakers across the United States have introduced at least 240 anti-Chinese business proposals this year, including last year. For example, there's a Kansas law that restricts the purchase of drones, artificial intelligence software, and medical equipment from Chinese-owned companies, while Arkansas law prohibits foreign-owned data centers within its borders, prohibits Chinese sister city ties, and prohibits state and local contracts with Chinese businesses for promotional items like coffee mugs, t-shirts, and keychains. Talking about getting down to dirty details. Next, there is no publicly available data on the number of APIDAs who have relied on birthright citizenship, but birthright citizenship has historically been a significant pathway to citizenship for many in the APIDA community. On January 20, 2025, the President issued an executive order seeking to significantly narrow birthright citizenship that's set by the 14th Amendment and construed by the Wong Kim-Ark case that we talked about. The argument underlying that executive order is that birthright citizenship does not confer to a person born in the U.S. whose mother was unlawfully present in the United States or whose father was not a U.S. citizen or permanent resident at the time of birth. Those exclusions, however, do not appear in the 14th Amendment alongside with exclusions that do appear. Next on the list. On March 25, 2025, the President invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to support his executive order deporting Venezuelan immigrants suspected of being gang members. All this without due process. The removal of Abrego Garcia, in that connection, was challenged by his family in court as having been in error. The family said he was never a member of the gang, and secondly, they pointed to ICE's admission that it was an administrative error. Notwithstanding that, the administration has not yet brought him back. You might recall that the Alien Enemies Act was used to support Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, leading to the internment of U.S. nationals of Japanese descent. President Trump has indicated his power under that law extends to removing U.S. citizens without due process. And in fact, in the past few weeks, there have been several U.S. citizens removed without due process from the United States. A few of them were children with birthright citizenship. On May 2nd, this is like last week, less than a week ago, 4 days ago, a federal court in Texas ruled that the administration's use of the Alien Enemies Act to detain and deport Venezuelan immigrants was unlawful. And just yesterday, news came out about an intelligence memo that undercuts the president's rationale for using the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelans. But obviously, there's more to come here. Things are still in play. The immigration crackdown that's occurring all around us is consistent with what candidate Trump said during the election. That is, immigrants are, quote unquote, poisoning the blood of our country. Because the U.S. immigration laws and practices have been admittedly a holy mess for decades, many Americans support reform and heightened enforcement. But some immigration experts believe that the current crackdown disproportionately hurts people of color because of racial profiling and selective enforcement. On the outflow side, we've already touched on several ways that the administration is deploying shock and awe efforts to deport immigrants and even several citizens of the United States without due process. On the inflow side, on March 14, 2025, the Trump administration released a draft list of 43 countries that could be affected by a possible future travel ban. This is reminiscent of a travel ban that was instituted in the first Trump administration, but that travel ban was really limited to Muslim-majority countries, North Korea and Venezuela. So there's been an expansive list that is under consideration. The proposal for Ban 2 lists a lot more countries whose citizens may face restrictions on entering the United States. However, as of now, the proposed Travel Ban 2, let's call it, has been indefinitely postponed with no new date set, since the State Department continues to evaluate which countries should be subject to the ban. Next item. Consistent with other attempts to reduce the number of immigrants in this country, at the beginning of April, that's last month, the Trump administration started to revoke the visas of thousands of students from abroad who are studying in the United States. And this is without prior notice. On April 25, 2025, that was what, 2 weeks ago? The Trump administration announced it was going to rescind those revocations. This is after more than 100 lawsuits and 50 restraining orders issued by courts and a series of court losses. Again, the story here is still unfolding because the revocation process can be reinstituted on a drop of a dime. Perhaps even more shameful, the administration also announced the revocation of temporary protected status that applied to tens of thousands of previously admitted refugees. And that includes Afghans who supported the US during the war in Afghanistan. And that, if they actually are sent back to their quote-unquote home country, that exposes them to great bodily harm and probably, in many instances, death. All right, we're on the China Initiative, and forgive me because this list is long, but it's not my doing, okay? The China Initiative was a program instituted in 2018, and the purpose was to prosecute potential Chinese spies in American research and industry. Launched in November of 2018, the program targeted hundreds of prominent Chinese American academics and scientists. About 250 lost their jobs. Many more had their careers ruined. It was subsequently determined that many of the prosecutions had been based on faulty or even false evidence. Critics alleged that the China Initiative also contributed to anti-Asian sentiments and violence during the pandemic. On February 23, 2022, the Department of Justice announced it was ending the China Initiative. But you know what? It may have resurfaced, though not in name, but in practice. Xiaofeng Wang is a Chinese American computer scientist known for his research in privacy and cybersecurity. He had joined the faculty of Indiana University in 2004, became a full professor in 2015, and an associate dean in 2023. On March 24, 2025, first, his wife, who worked at Indiana University's library as a researcher, was fired without prior notice. 4 days later, on March 28, Professor Wang was also fired without prior notice. That same day, the Wang's homes were raided by the FBI and the United States Department of Homeland Security, allegedly on suspicions that he passed on some sensitive information to the Chinese government. This is without the Wangs having been charged, and this is without any prior notice. Thus far, no evidence of wrongdoing has been released by the government. Faculty at Indiana University are up in arms, and many have stepped up to defend the Wangs against what they say are false accusations. However, the story is still unfolding. It's very recent. So we should all keep an eye out on that to see whether or not there is a de facto China Initiative 2. Next on the list, on February 14, 2025, Valentine's Day, the U.S. Department of Education issued a Dear Colleague letter to all educational institutions receiving federal funds that read, "With this guidance, the Trump administration is directing schools to end the use of racial preferences and race stereotypes in their programs and activities." Recipients were given 2 weeks to eliminate admission practices of that sort in all DEI programs. When I was doing this presentation, it occurred to me that if I was asked by a school to do this presentation for its students, would that subject the school to an investigation and possible loss of federal funding? I think so. However, on April 24, 2025, a federal district court in New Hampshire blocked the Trump administration's directives that threatened to cut federal funding for schools with DEI programs. Again, it's so recent that the story is still unfolding. On March 20, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education. What will be the consequence of that dismantling? Among other things, experts say that critical support for underserved students and vulnerable children in our communities will be at risk, including those who have disabilities or need English as a second language assistance. We're down to the last one. Yay. On March 1, 2025, President Trump signed Executive Order 14224, making English the official language of the United States. It revoked Order 13166 that was signed by President Clinton in the year 2000. The executive order signed by President Clinton sought to give access to government-related services to persons with limited English proficiency. The net effect of Executive Order 14224, signed by President Trump, will be to make it harder for persons with limited English proficiency to access government-related services. And that includes, I believe, the right to vote. All right. What can we do? Everything's so bleak. All right. Although we might feel we live in unprecedented times, as Reverend Niemöller's quote shows, others have experienced similar governmental oppression. Take his words to heart and speak up and push back wherever and whenever you see injustice and falsehoods. On the right-hand side of the slide, I've listed some suggestions for how you can proceed if you want to take some action and don't know where to start. In the interest of time, because I've taken up a lot of your time, take a snapshot of this page and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about any of these suggestions or simply want to talk about it. I will leave a bunch of my cards, name cards, here up in the front if you want to take me up on my offer, because I want to save some time now for some Q&A. Does anybody have any questions? I'll try to answer them. Yes, please, Al.
Thank you very much. I thought it was really wonderful, although also horrible presentation. You said something that sparked my interest, and there have been a lot of critical studies of the Nazi ideology, and you said something that struck me as very, very important for us to really think about it, to keep the American blood clean. That was the very ideological argument by Hitler and his gangsters to kill all Jews, because the Jews were identified as vermin, as bacteria, as viruses. And Hitler wanted to be the new Robert Koch, who had discovered virus and bacteria, and he wanted to cleanse the German blood. This, all what we just observed, is straight out of Hitler's playbook. And I think we would all do really well to study what happened, unfortunately, in Germany in 1933 to 1945.
Absolutely, thank you for that. And Reverend Martin Niemöller was put in a concentration camp for objecting to some of what the Nazi regime was doing. And his quote. Now, it's a great quote, but unfortunately it's in vogue now, and there must be a good reason why everybody's using that. But thank you very much.